You're listening to Engineuity, the podcast that dives into the wonderful world of everything industrial. From the birth of the first combustion engine to breakthrough hybrid power technologies, Engineuity examines just about everything the industry has to offer. The podcast provides a platform for industry leaders, engineers, scientists, and small business owners to educate listeners about past, present, and future industries across the planet.
Okay, well, hello and welcome to Engineuity Episode 5, at least we think. I'm Zach Turner with Anderson Industrial Engines, joined today by Roger Hoy, the director of the University of Nebraska Tractor Test Lab. Roger was gracious enough to give us a nice tour of the facilities and all their capabilities here, and excited to jump in and talk about what it is you guys do, why the lab exists, and maybe get into some of the engineering details of the testing that you guys do. But Roger, can you give us a brief introduction to yourself and just the general purpose or main mission of the lab here at the university?
Well, this is Roger Hoy. I have been the director of the Tractor Test Lab for 16 years now, and prior to doing that, I was a staff engineer with John Deere. I grew up around farming in Georgia, so agriculture's kind of been in my blood my whole life. So the Tractor Test Lab has existed for a long time. Back in 1919, the Nebraska legislature passed a law that required any manufacturer wanting to sell a tractor in Nebraska to bring a representative sample to the University of Nebraska and prove that it performed as advertised before they would be allowed to sell that model. And, back in 1919 and 1920, the primary competitor for a tractor was not another tractor, it was a horse. Mm-hmm. And so you would see advertisements of does the work of 5 good horses for the price of 2 poor ones and things like that. And obviously for an industry in its infancy at that point, there were a number of disreputable manufacturers in the business, and the Nebraska legislation was an attempt to try to stomp down on that a little bit and either get the disreputable manufacturers to become reputable or get out of the business altogether.
So the story behind how that act came about is a bit of an interesting one, right? I mean, it sounds like it came from one disgruntled farmer and then kind of ended up as a piece of legislation.
Well, sort of. I mean, I think there were other disgruntled farmers that he knew about too.
Sure.
But it was a gentleman named Wilmot Crozier who farmed in Polk County, Nebraska. And he bought his first tractor in 1916, and it was a Ford Model B. Now, this wasn't a Henry Ford-made tractor. This was a Minneapolis Ford, and the story I always heard was a couple of guys that developed this tractor hired an accountant whose last name was Ford and called themselves the Ford Tractor Company to leverage off Henry Ford's fame with the Model T. Consequently, when Ford started building tractors a few years later, he couldn't call them Ford tractors, so he called it Ford and Sons or Fordsons, as some may remember that name. Well, the tractor did not perform as advertised. It broke down a lot. He couldn't get any parts. So he talked to the Minneapolis Ford Company, and they told him, well, if you trade that one in for a 1917 model, all your problems will be solved. So he did that, and he discovered the 1917 tractor was really the same as the 1916 tractor. So his third tractor was one called a Little Bull, with which he got no satisfaction either, but he was persistent. And his fourth tractor he bought was a Rumley oil pull, which was the first internally lubricated tractor, and he found it did exactly what the manufacturer said and did it well. So Mr. Crozier was elected to the Nebraska legislature in 1919 from the Polk County area, whatever that district might have been back in those days, I don't know. And of course, in those days, we didn't have a unicameral. We still had a bicameral legislature. So he teamed up with Senator Charles Warner, and the two of them wrote the Nebraska Tractor Test Law. And there had been some earlier attempts at tractor testing. We actually started off in Canada, up in Winnipeg, where they did the Winnipeg tractor trials. Oh. And it was an attempt for the early agricultural engineers to try to start quantifying tractors and understanding them so they could make known to farmers what was important to know. And one of the gentlemen involved with that was named Leon Chase, who was a University of Nebraska graduate and was the first department chair of the agricultural engineering department here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
So Chase was the technical advisor to Senator Warner and Congressman Crozier. And one of the things he wrote in the law was that the university's agricultural engineering department should be responsible for verifying performance claims.
Imagine that.
Thus we were born.
So the law prohibited the sale of untested tractors in the state?
Yes, you had to prove that your tractor performed as advertised to be allowed to sell. Now, there was a provision that still exists today that allowed a tractor to schedule testing, provide all of his advertising information, and get a temporary sales permit that would last until after the testing was complete and his claims could be verified.
Okay.
But of course, you take a risk doing that because if you don't perform as advertised, you probably have to go buy all those tractors back.
Mm-hmm. So that law is still in effect in the state of Nebraska then? Has it changed at all, or is it still pretty much the same same legislation? The
basic rationale in the law is the same as it was in 1919. There have been some changes. I don't really think back in 1919 the legislature thought this law would be necessary for very long. I think the way they viewed it was we would get reputable tractor manufacturers and there would no longer be a need.
Right.
But what happened instead was the marketing departments of the tractor companies started competing on the test numbers that were achieved here at Nebraska, and it became a marketing requirement to test at Nebraska. And so we're still that way today. That's still the primary reason why the law exists.
So when a new what delineates what is a new tractor versus what is a similar platform with maybe a few different features? What's the bright line that triggers a new test to have to be done on a platform?
Okay, give you a little background first. The tractor test law also specified that there would be a board of 3 tractor test engineers under the control of the university that would examine all test reports and determine the rules for testing. So rules by the Tractor Test Board go out as board actions.
Okay.
And they're available on our website at tractortestlab.unl.edu for any that might want to look. And we have a particular board action 27 that defines what a model is. And so it has elements like you have to have the same engine, the same cylinder displacement, the same torque and fuel consumption throughout the range the engine operates, the same sort of chassis like wheeled or tracked or whatnot, and a few other elements that defines when a tractor is the same. So if any of those elements are not met, then it's a new tractor model that has to be tested.
Okay. And so when a manufacturer introduces a new model, or at least by the criteria that the board sets a new model, they come to the test lab and say, "Hey, we have a new model. We need to schedule testing." And
yeah, the way that generally works is they tell me sometimes even years ahead that, hey, out in 2025 we're going to have 16 models to test, and they may not even tell me what they are at that point.
Mm-hmm.
But as we get closer to it and they want to actually start scheduling the test, they are required to submit to us an operator's manual and advertising literature for the tractor. And, of course, we also look at any internet websites they may use for advertising as well.
Making sure that they match what they've submitted to you in terms of claims for power and everything else.
Right. Yep. They normally submit a temporary sales permit that will allow them to sell the tractor until it can be tested and verified. And we require them to submit a $7,000 test deposit, which will be applied to the actual cost of testing. And that just keeps everybody honest. When you have $7,000 in the game, you generally show up with the tractor when you're supposed to and test it. And so we will also at that time pick out at least a specific test season that the tractor will be tested in. When I start building my schedule for each season, I go to whoever paid the first test deposit and say, okay, here's the available test weeks. You got first pick, and then I go to the next and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes there's a little negotiation between the tractor lab and various manufacturers to work out something that's amenable to everybody that'll work. Usually that's resolved amicably without actually having to, hold down a hammer too hard on anybody. And, then when it's time to test, okay, that week we've got reserved to test that tractor. And so we schedule 1 week per tractor. And that seems to work well. If the weather cooperates, all of our equipment works, and their tractor works, we can generally knock out a tractor about every 3 days. But it's probably only 60% of the time that all three of those requirements are met. So we have some days where we don't get a lot done in. So generally a week per tractor is a good ballpark figure.
So I know that there's some pretty stringent temperature conditions for some of the tests. So are you able to test all year round?
No. For drawbar work, we have to be between 40 and 80 degrees outside.
Okay.
So it's not that you couldn't hit those conditions in July or August or even January and February once in a while, but it's so rare that you can that we generally don't do testing in the winter or the summer, and it's more of a spring-fall thing. For our power takeoff testing, we try really hard to hold 73 degrees Fahrenheit inside the lab. We can heat the lab, but we can't cool it. So,
okay,
depending on what month we're doing and what the weather is, sometimes we might start one of those tests at 4 in the morning or even earlier so we can get done before it gets too hot outside.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, something like that we could do in the winter too if it were absolutely necessary, because we can heat the space, just not cool it.
Yeah, that gives you an inventory problem, though, doesn't it? You can't have 50 tractors stacked up waiting for PTO tests, right?
No, we can't. And also, with the value of these tractors today, mostly these machines are already sold to some customer, and there's high demand. Yeah. So there's generally great desire by the manufacturers to get them out of here and on their way to wherever they're going as soon as they can after testing. Yeah.
Well, so the other thing I was reading about on the website is the testing you do for the Organization of Economic Cooperation Development, OECD, and that is a global organization?
Yeah, there are OECD testing stations in many countries. At the moment, the Nebraska Tractor Test Lab is the only OECD testing station in the Western Hemisphere.
Okay.
But most European countries have a test station. There's stations in China, India, Korea, Japan, overseas. And we will accept test results from other OECD test stations in lieu of conducting the test here.
That was going to be my question. So if I don't know if I want to name drop an Asian tractor manufacturer, but maybe an Indian tractor manufacturer wants to go to market in the U.S. but has that tested it in OECD accredited or approved facility somewhere else in the world, that can still be sold here. That meets the criteria for the
if they meet their
Nebraska
claims, yeah. So if they're going to test at another OECD test station, rather than asking for a $7,000 deposit, we generally ask for a letter from that test station indicating when the tractor is scheduled to be tested.
Okay.
After the OECD report is written and distributed to us, we will compare that to their advertising and then recommend whether they get a sales permit or not.
Okay.
And we do not enforce the law either. That's the State Department of Agriculture. All the university does is conduct the testing and make recommendations to the State Department of Agriculture about the issuing of sales permits.
So one of the questions I want to ask was kind of this this pass-fail determination. So we'll get in. I want to get into the specific testing that you do in a little bit, but if a tractor's, I'm assuming we have margins that they have to meet within the criteria, and if they're way outside the margins on one maybe specification and inside the margins on the other, is that the board that makes that decision about how to essentially pass fail that particular model?
Yeah, the board is ultimately responsible, but they've established rules that we follow for that.
Okay.
So generally speaking, we have things that we call major performance claims and minor performance claims. So a major performance claim, for example, would be rated power takeoff output at standard PTO speed or rated engine speed, and they have to make one of those claims to come to test. They can make a drawbar power claim also, but usually it's a PTO claim. And so if they miss that claim, even by a 100th decimal point, then we do not recommend a sales permit be issued, and we inform the Department of Ag to follow the law on enforcement of a missed claim. If it's a minor,
that's for the major claim, so that you have to exceed. You cannot miss that major claim by any threshold.
You can meet it, you just can't do anything less than meet it.
Okay.
So you can meet or exceed, but you can't go below it. And we don't round here either. So a minor claim, maybe the manufacturer states the noise level in the cab is 69 decibels, and we test it and find it 70 decibels. What we do then is in the test report, in the comment section, we write a statement that says, this tractor did not meet its claim of 69 decibels of noise at the operator ear. And that's usually a negative enough thing that it's not repeated, because the other manufacturer, of course, they immediately spot test reports when we issue them, and missed claims go right to their dealer network right away to be pointed out to potential customers. So there's enough negativity in missing even a minor performance claim that while it does happen, it usually doesn't happen repetitively.
Okay. Can we talk a little bit about what the different areas that you guys test here are? So we just going from memory. I know the big one at least is the drawbar power. So you showed us your test rig. It's a very, very impressive test rig for drawbar power. But can you just give us a brief overview of what that test entails and what you're measuring and kind of how you're measuring for that test?
Well, for our drawbar test, we require the tractor to be unballasted. So what that means is no additional ballast weights, but all fluid tanks full. So fuel tanks full, radiators full, oil sumps, hydraulic sumps, so on. And we will do ballasted testing after we complete unballasted testing, and most manufacturers want that on at least a few models, and we'll include those results, but that's optional. So what we generally want to do during the drawbar test is we want to document the travel speed and the maximum force that can be developed in each field gear the tractor has. So we define those to be a field gear being between 2 miles an hour and 10 miles an hour of unloaded travel speed. So we'll identify what those gears are, and we will run the test by increasing the load gradually until we find out what the absolute limit is, and then we'll record data. So our test track is an oval that has long sides laid out east to west. For each test point, we want to have 2 runs going east and 2 runs going west that we can average to take out any effective wind resistance that might we typically have wind coming from the west here, and we can actually see in the data a little better performance with a tailwind than a headwind. It's minor. The tractor is always being driven by a representative of the manufacturer. It's tough on them because we don't let them turn the air conditioning on. If they decide to do that, we see that immediately in the fuel data that shows up, or we see 25 horsepower go away as soon as that air conditioning compressor goes on. So a lot of that is just with windows open, kind of do it the old-fashioned way before tractors were so comfortable to ride in.
Yep. So when doing that drawbar testing, does the manufacturer get to choose tires, and does like the soil condition of the track impact the test results, or is that you're just measuring pull from the tractor? So is it independent of soil conditions and tires and those types of things?
It's dependent on tires. For the first 36 years of operation until 1956, we had a dirt track, but the object was to have a consistent track for every tractor. So there was a lot of grinding, packing, watering, churning, packing, watering. And in 1956, it was decided, let's just go to concrete because that's a consistent surface, and we've been on concrete ever since.
So the drawbar testing is done on concrete?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But now tires matter. So most tractors have various tire options. It seems like on the four-wheel drives, what's generally been done is instead of two larger tractor tires on each side or duals, it's typically three narrow triples. The manufacturer's free to choose that. Tire pressure is also real important as well. So we weigh the tractor before going out and determine what the front axle and rear axle have to carry, divide that weight by the number of tires on the axle, then go to the Tire and Rim Association information for that tire and say, okay, here are the appropriate air pressures for this load on this tire. Now, the manufacturer normally picks the lowest he can get away with, but we don't let them cheat those things down below because one of our requirements are that the tractor is always operated in the manner that the manufacturer requests. And that might not be the manufacturer guy that's on site, but it is what's written in their operator's manuals.
For recommended tire pressures?
And everything else.
Yeah.
Even on how to ballast a tractor, we've had ballasting arrangements that we've looked at and then looked at the manual and said, okay, we can't do it this way. You're only allowed 2 450-pound weights on this steel rim. You can't put 3 there, even though they might fit. So
do you get the engineers cursing at the technical writers in some cases like that?
That has happened before. More generally, it's more the engineers are cursing at marketing for the performance claims they put in that are unverified.
I'm looking over here at my marketing guys.
Well, a very common misclaim is the hydraulic power claim, because the way this sort of works is marketing asks the engineers, can you give me the specifications of the hydraulic pump? Mm-hmm. And they publish the pressure and flow rate that the pump can develop. But we measure the hydraulic performance at the remote SCV valves, and there's some loss going through all the lines and valves before you get back to the remote. So I've had engineers here trying to meet the claim and then finally realizing it's not physically possible because my marketing went with the pump data instead of what really comes out the back of the tractor data.
Well, so two interesting things, which was I assumed you were measuring auxiliary hydraulic capability, but you're actually measuring the main hydraulic circuit flow and pressure on the machine, right?
Well, what's available to the farmer? So we, typically tractors come with a hydraulic system and a hydraulic pump built in, and they typically, that hydraulic power may be used internally on the tractor for steering and braking or even operating a 3-point hitch. But normally there's some hydraulic remotes to power implements. So it's at those remotes where we measure the hydraulic performance because that's the power that would be available to a farmer.
Okay. All right. So it is at the remote or auxiliary hydraulic ports.
Yes.
Okay. All right. The other testing you do is actual PTO power, and you're using just a more traditional dyno to measure the PTO power?
Yes. We back the tractor up to our dynamometer and attach the shafts. We may raise the tractor a little bit on blocks if necessary so that we have what we shoot for is a 0.5 degree of misalignment in our PTO shaft. Perfectly straight is rough on the U-joint, so about 0.5 degree is what we try to achieve. And, of course, we tie into the tractor's fuel system. We supply all the fuel during both the drawbar and the PTO testing that the tractor expends, and we measure how much of that is used. And then we operate the tractor at a variety of operating points. So normally a power claim is made at either rated engine speed or standard PTO speed. So that's usually what we start with, and then the manufacturer can relax after he's made his major claim. So that's a 1-hour test where what goes into the test report is the average torque, speed, fuel consumption, power developed during that 1-hour period.
Okay.
We do an hour at standard PTO speed also, or rated engine, depending on which one we started at. Most people advertise at rated engine, but some advertise at standard PTO speed. We usually start with wherever the power is claimed. Some of them don't think about it, and they claim power at both points, and so they have to make both points. Then we do a lug run generally, and what a lug run is rated engine speed of the tractor might be 2,100 RPM. So we have the 2,100 point from the rated engine speed test. But then we will leave the tractor at full throttle, and we will apply load to reduce the engine speed to 2050 and collect data at that point. Then 2,000, then 1950, and so on. And we go down to generally about half of whatever rated engine speed is, so like 1050 RPM.
So you're going past the maximum torque point?
Yeah, we want to find the maximum torque point, and we also want to find the maximum power point. So maximum power might be somewhere in the 1800 RPM range. Peak torque might be more in the 1500 or 1400 RPM range. Although it's getting hard to tell because these tractors now have these electronic controls and they can build these power curves however they want. So there's often a band of 200 or 300 RPM that max power could be anywhere within on a given day. It only varies maybe 1 or 2 horsepower throughout that band.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask, and that's part of the trick is that when you can kind of shape these power curves any way that you want, and you also can electronically select your governing type, whether you're doing droop governing or asynchronous governing or even changing throughout the power band, the governing strategy, that can be kind of difficult to almost reverse engineer on the dyno, I would think.
Well, we don't try to reverse engineer it. We just try to see what the tractor will give us. And, of course, as far as engine and computer settings, before we start any of this work, we have the manufacturer fill out a form for us that he signs and we sign that signs the tractor onto official test. So at that point forward, we don't permit the manufacturer to do anything to that tractor that's not found in the operator's manual. So he can check the oil each day. He can top it off if that's in the operator's manual. But if he wants to make a software change that's in the service manual, he can't do that.
Yeah, I was gonna say no alternate ECU strategies for the test only, none of that shenanigans.
And of course, if something breaks on test, we will allow him to repair it, but then we will watch the repair, and that will become documented in the test report under the repair section. And that doesn't look really good either because we're basically testing a new tractor. So when you're seeing these 0-hour failures on it, that's not a good look for a manufacturer.
Yeah. Did we miss a test? So we got drawbar PTO. You talked about the noise and sound testing you guys do. That's both in the cab and also in the surround of the machine. Yeah.
So we call it noise at the operator ear. So what the operator is exposed to. And bystander noise. And we're really proud of our noise test. Can I talk a minute or two about that?
Yeah.
So back in the late 1960s, we've always listened to farmers, and some of our farmer focus groups were telling us, these tractors are really pretty loud and we're hard of hearing. Could you do something about that? So we developed a noise test. Now, back in the 1970s, that took this whole desk full of test equipment to measure sound. Today, it's a little meter. It's not much bigger than your hand. But in 1970, we started measuring sound at the operator ear. Now, we told the manufacturers we were going to do this, and they weren't very enthusiastic about it. But we did it anyway, and I think the first tractor we measured was 94 decibels. And it quickly became a marketing item to compete on. And today, in a cab-equipped tractor, 67, 68, 69 decibels, which is, that's comfortable sound. That's lower than a lot of people will play their radios. That's typically what you have. It was really interesting. The graduate student that worked at the Tractor Test Lab that developed the sound test as his master's thesis went to work for Caterpillar. And 4 or 5 years after he'd been working for Caterpillar sent him over to the Iowa State Fair just to check out what agriculture was doing. And he came back with this report that it's a lot quieter than our stuff.
Yeah.
Well, Caterpillar couldn't have that, so they started going into noise reduction too, and the rest of the industry followed. Now, we certainly can't claim full credit for this, but I do think we were a catalyst that made it happen maybe even a few decades before it ordinarily would have.
See, that's pretty early. Even the auto manufacturers weren't too concerned about noise, vibration, and harshness that early.
Oh, no.
I mean, it wasn't until, I don't know, maybe into the early 90s or something, into which actually having like a quiet, comfortable, cab was a big deal in a marketing piece in the automotive side.
Yeah.
And today, most major off-highway manufacturers have NVH engineers, as part of their standard array of design and testing.
And of course, there have been various governmental bodies that have helped with that, like
Right.
OSHA had published noise requirements, but they didn't come into existence until like 1970 or 69 or something. So,
Yeah.
Some of the things they've done, I think, have been a catalyst also to help with this.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you about fuel consumption. And some of the testing you're doing, the PTO testing's at least an hour, and I don't know how long it takes you to do a run down each side of the field for the drawbar testing, but
Depends what gear we're in.
yeah, right. But how are you tracking and or compensating fuel consumed for like regenerations, or are you measuring total fluid consumption and monitoring DEF consumption in addition to fluid or fuel consumption?
We monitor both depth consumption and fuel consumption, and those are live measurements, so we're getting the instantaneous data for that. We had a real issue with regenerating particulate filters because we felt like we had to do something because some diesel fuel is consumed during those regenerations.
Right.
And so that was an example where we had wonderful cooperation with the industry. In fact, Adhere allowed us to come over to their product engineering center and visit their test labs before any diesel particulate filters were introduced onto the market. And they showed us, well, this is how we test it. And it was in an engine cell. And they had the regenerating particulate filter lying on an extremely precise scale. And so they were able to see particulate increase in mass of that filter as particulate was added in all sorts of different loading conditions. And it was an interesting problem because to regenerate the filter, you have to have the exhaust gas at a high enough temperature.
Mm-hmm.
So how much diesel you burn depends on what the tractor's doing. So if we have a tractor, probably the best case would be a tractor operating around peak torque. You kind of have engine revolutions about 1,400 RPM a minute, so there's not as much gas to heat as at a higher engine speed. And you have extremely high exhaust gas temperatures from combustion, so you don't need very much fuel there. The worst possible condition would be something running just at high idle with little to no load on it, a lot of gas and low exhaust gas temperatures that you have to spend a lot more fuel on. So the end result was we decided we would observe 3 particulate filter regenerations, and one of them is conducted at rated engine speed at full load, and the other 2 are conducted at partial throttle, partial load portions of the PTO test.
Okay.
And so we'll actually have a manufacturer trigger a regeneration. We will be running already before the regeneration begins, so we have a baseline fuel without. Then we can see the higher level of fuel that's consumed during the regeneration and the length of the regeneration. And that allows us to determine, okay, what percentage of total tractor fuel consumed is consumed during diesel fuel regenerations. And it's not very high. It's usually less than 0.5% of the total fuel burn.
Yeah, but it's measurable, right?
Yeah, it is measurable. And we felt like we really weren't being honest if we weren't including the DEF consumption and we weren't including the diesel fuel used for regeneration, because those are operating costs to a farmer that buys that tractor.
Right. And DEF consumption likewise is going to depend on load and temperature and everything else in terms of how much DEF fluid you're going to have to inject as well. But it's not like a regeneration in which it's just periodic. You're gonna be dosing some level of DEF most of the time in the operating cycle.
Yeah, generally no load is near 0% and full load is highest. But different manufacturers have different strategies. Right. So when we came to interim Tier 4 and that went in for off-road machinery in January 1st of 2011, Deere chose not to do DEF at that point. They chose to go with a regenerating particulate filter, and the advantage was that's one less fuel that the farmer had to stock on the farm.
Yeah, there's just a single fluid solution, right?
Yeah. Other manufacturers realized that by injecting a lot of DEF, we can make the fuel economy look really, really good. In fact, AGCO even started DEF injection back at Tier 3 when it really wasn't necessary, because by adding enough DEF, you could actually run more like a Tier 2 set of fuel settings, and you had wonderful fuel economy. But, at the end of the day, you had a lot of DEF consumption, and I don't know how it is today with fuel prices, what they were. They vary amongst themselves, but I've always said a good rule of thumb is a gallon of DEF is about the same as a gallon of diesel. Now, right now, that might not be absolutely true, but over the long haul, it probably is going to be priced somewhat equivalently, understanding there is variation in both fuel and DEF prices. It goes on all the time.
Yeah. But that total fluid consumption is becoming, I can sense the market getting more and more aware of it, in terms of asking those questions about what the DEF consumption is, being aware of it as a consumable. And I think there was a period of time in which, there's this extra fluid, doesn't use a whole lot, don't worry about it. But now it seems to be that people are aware of it and asking questions.
Well, I think farmers have become a lot more discerning about fuel economy. I think it wasn't so long ago where you could talk to a number of farmers and they would know their cost of seed down to the nearest tenth of a cent.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't really think about fuel. They had a fuel tank on farm, and whenever it got low, the fuel supplier filled it up. I think there's become a real understanding that those energy costs for fuel are very significant today, and that whatever strategies they can employ to reduce that's good. And I think you've seen the manufacturers react. Like most of these modern tractors, you can go to your digital display and you can see your fuel cost per acre for whatever you're doing live. And I think even in tractor selection now, when it's time to buy a new tractor, I think sometimes it may come down to one tractor being a little more fuel efficient or total fluid efficient than another tractor that makes the decision.
Yeah. Fuel's, at least today, fuel's got to be one of the higher input costs of operating a farm. In terms of, especially in terms of consumables, but aside from the seed and equipment.
Yeah, it takes a lot of guts to be a farmer. You're literally playing around with seven figures every year, and it takes a lot of stomach to be doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to talk, just to rewind a little bit, but the funding for the lab, you're part of the university, but you're completely independently funded from the test charges from the manufacturers, or is that you get funding from other sources?
Well, we do some non-official tractor testing. Sometimes it's overflow testing for a company, or maybe they just want a third-party verification of something. And so that all comes in as income as well. That's helpful. But we are self-funded, so we're not using any state tax dollars to operate the Tractor Test Lab. Our funding comes entirely from the test fees that are paid for tractor and other types of testing. And so I do have a pretty sweet deal with the university. Every year they take 5% of my income, and in return for that 5%, I get use of the facility. I get the internal utilities and basic maintenance for the facilities covered by the university. And
so that's not a bad deal at all.
It's not a bad deal at all for me. But other than that, there's no state support for the tractor lab. It all comes directly from test fees that we generate.
Yeah, very cool. And the staff is how many kind of full-time permanent staff do you have versus how much of the staff is made up of students or graduate students that are enrolled in the university?
Well, this fall we're going to have 2 permanent test engineers, And then half of my salary as the director is paid by the Tractor Test Lab. The rest of it is paid through state dollars for teaching and research, more of a traditional faculty appointment. And I haven't counted yet, but usually it's somewhere around 25, 28 students that work for me part-time here. And so the students are great. They work for minimum wage and no benefits. But what they get is a wonderful line to put on their resume, and what they also get is a lot of contact with the test engineers that the manufacturers send out with equipment.
Yeah.
So most of my students, for internships and permanent jobs upon graduation, I would say half to two-thirds of those go to work for somebody that brought a tractor here for testing while they were a student.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And is that all agricultural engineering students, or is there some mechanical engineers, or what all disciplines do you have amongst that group of 20 or 28?
The majority would be agricultural engineers. We usually have a loose mechanical engineer or two that probably should be an agricultural engineer that hasn't figured it out yet. And the other source that's maybe 20% are students out of our Mechanized Systems Management program, which is going to the Ag Systems Technology program. They're renaming it, but it hasn't happened. So that's more of an engineering light type of curriculum. Maybe for some of the students that really like getting their hands dirty and getting into things and have good mechanical aptitude, but just don't want to suffer through all the calculus and engineering theory classes.
Less math. Yeah.
Less math. But, what's beautiful about it is virtually all of these student employees, and for that matter, me and my permanent employees, we all grew up farm kids.
Yeah.
So they already come with I don't know how to describe it, but they've all had an opportunity to care for living things at a much younger age. They've all kind of learned how the job just has to be done. Sometimes how it's done is less important than just getting it done. So good attitudes. They generally can work with maybe a little less supervision than some of the kids that didn't grow up that way. So, those qualities transfer over after they leave here as well. So they're usually highly prized employees when they leave UNL to go on to a more permanent career.
Well, it's one thing to operate a 400 or 500 horsepower tractor. It's another thing to operate the equipment to test it at its limits.
Yeah.
And the comfort factor that's required to actually do the testing, instrument, rig everything else up. I mean that.
And so they become familiar with all that, and they start to draw the connection of how when we're teaching them the theory, we can do something in a chalkboard in 30 seconds or a minute that might take 3 months in the real world to actually do practically. So, from that standpoint, you're getting people that when you interview them, they can talk about some problems that they've solved in the real world. And, it gives them more confidence, and it allows them to hit the ground running a little bit better when they get to those internships and permanent job offers.
Yeah, that's a fantastic experience. I mean, invaluable, really. Yeah. Looking forward to the future of agricultural equipment, tractors, and where powertrains are going with different types of powertrains, all the way to just full electric powertrains. I know that stuff's not really in the market yet, but is the testing done here going to need to adapt to those types of powertrains, or are you mostly agnostic to how the power is generated on the machine, and just you're really trying to test the performance of the machine from the operator perspective?
Well, we're discussing those things right now, and to comment on electric tractors, there's a few out there now, but they're typically more in specialty things, orchards, vineyards, so on.
Right.
And so my thought for an electric tractor to be successful in the row crop farming that goes on in Nebraska, it probably needs to be able to run for 12 hours or so on one battery charge, outputting the power required to pull planters, anhydrous ammonia, even deep rippers at times through the soil. It has to recharge in probably no more time or difficulty than refueling a diesel fuel tank would be today. And it has to be cost effective.
Yeah.
And so I think the cost effective piece will take care of itself. Right now we're not there, but as the technology develops and there's more acceptance, the cost is going to come down. I think the recharging problem is almost there right now. We had a little insight into what the U.S. military is doing, and they would like to have electric tanks because storing electrical power on a battlefield is much less explosive than storing gasoline or petroleum type jet fuel.
Yeah.
And they also have some other things going where if the tank can be quiet, it can perhaps detect incoming rounds and reorient or get out of the way before the round lands.
Mm-hmm.
So, they're doing it for more than just to be green. But there's some recharging technologies that have been developed that, eventually will filter out into the commercial side of things, and you can recharge quickly and portably. So what's left is the battery capacity, and right now we did a little back-of-the-napkin study here a month or two ago, and the weight of the battery pack for enough electrical energy to operate a row crop tractor for 12 hours is probably 3 to 4 times what the tractor should weigh for best tractor performance in the soil. And, of course, the volume is also a bit excessive. But if we looked at the same point in 2006, those numbers were much higher. And if you draw a line between those 2 points, it sort of says somewhere in the 2030s, power density and volume are going to reduce to where it really is practical. Now, you brought up another question for me. Well, let me stay on electric for a minute. So we're right now looking at how do we test electric tractors. And we're thinking of that 2 ways. What we think might come sooner than fully electric tractors may be electric power offboarding from tractors.
Yeah.
So that may replace some of the hydraulic applications. Like if I have a planter and I can spin the blowers with electric motors, it's a lot better than hydraulic motors. So we may first see electric power offboarding, and I think we would try to test that the same way we test any other power. How much power can it produce, and how much fuel would be consumed? When we go to fully electric tractors, there's a school of thought that thinks we should be documenting how long it takes to recharge the tractor. We should be documenting how long the tractor can run on a charge. But I think I'm opposed to that because I think that's a transitive condition. And because of what I think is necessary for these to be accepted, those are going to have to match or better diesel fuel. So my real thought is we would test an electric tractor the same way we test a diesel power tractor, and it would be let's document the power that's available to the farmer by the various power outlets that an implement might attach to. That might be too simplistic, but that's kind of where my head is now to sort of keep the faith with everything we've done for the last 100 or so years.
Well, the drawbar test doesn't really need to change, right? It's just measuring how much you can pull through the field. The PTO test presumably would still be the same. But I think it's that measurement of energy consumption that really becomes the difficult part.
Well, we're measuring kilowatt hours instead of gallons per minute or something like that of fuel.
Right. Yeah.
So we would document those measurements, but I think we would be less concerned about recharge time and how long can I run in this condition, which some are trying to lead us to. I just feel like those are going to be non-issues by the time these things are really production ready for Nebraska farming.
Yeah, I think and EPA in Europe have also paved the way a little bit in terms of they're trying to answer that question with, we on the automotive side, we post a fuel or a couple of fuel economy figures, for internal combustion engine vehicles. How the hell do we measure range and standardize a range measurement in electric vehicles? And there's I imagine that's probably going to change over the next couple of years, but it's an active discussion. I think there's probably some groundwork laid for how you define duty cycles and how you commonize a test to be able to give everyone a standard, way to compare.
Well, I will
range.
tell you that we have had proposals from within OECD that we should have one or two numbers that document the fuel economy of a tractor like an on-road vehicle has, and we have really resisted that because the power that a tractor delivers is so widely and varied and varies so much application to application.
Yeah.
That we feel like all of the fuel economy data for all the operating points we publish are relevant and should be considered instead of trying to reduce that down to one or two numbers that just simply would not reflect so many operations that purchased tractor might be used in.
And I think that's where if you're measuring energy consumption throughout the test, same thing as measuring fuel consumption throughout the test, right? You can give a user. They can put together their own duty cycles and figure out how long that battery pack might last, right?
They would have all the information they would require to understand how many kilowatts of electricity will this tractor use for an operation or for a growing season or for a year or however, or during its life.
Yeah.
And what does that electricity cost me?
Mm-hmm.
Now, we have another disruptor that's going to affect all of this, and that is autonomy. And so we have, if we sort of look at the history of mechanization of agriculture, we had tractors that started appearing in the early decades of the 20th century. But really up until World War II, we were more majority animal power in farming. And the real mechanization of agriculture came after World War II. And so what we saw then was a lot of power growth, and the idea of that power growth is one operator could farm more land. And today somebody else could comment better than I could, but I'm sort of feeling like if you're not, if you're a corn and soybean guy and you're not farming probably at least 1,500 acres here in Nebraska, you're probably not making any money at it. So those farms have grown large, and of course what that's done is it's brought food prices down considerably, not just for Americans, but for all the world. But, we have tractors today. We've got some coming that are advertised at over, 640 horsepower. But if we don't have to have an operator sitting on the tractor, then maybe the reason for being so large starts to go away. And I could envision a future where one human may be supervising 25, 50, or 100 small autonomous vehicles that are running around in the field.
Yeah, that's kind of that reminds me of that scene from Interstellar where, he's got the autonomous combine that crawls home because it's got a problem or something, and the field's just being worked autonomously with a handful of machines.
Well, and the other problem is there's somewhere around 7.5 billion or so people in the world today. By the middle of this century, we're going to hit 10 billion, and it's only going to go up from there. We're not getting any more agricultural land.
Getting a lot less of it, actually.
We're
at least in this
land
country,
in the U.S. So we have to figure out how to produce more with the land that's available, and we're going to have to do it with less water, less chemicals, less fertilizer, so on and so forth in the future. So I feel like what autonomy is going to do is, instead of treating fields with the same treatment or sections of fields with the same treatment as we do today, I think we're going to arrive at a point where we're treating individual plants whenever and however they need to be treated individually to increase yield. And, if we were to look back about 100 years ago, a good yield for corn might be 25 or 30 bushels per acre. We're talking 250 or 300 bushels per acre today. So we're talking another tenfold increase that might be needed off of those acres to take us through this century and into the 22nd century. I'm not going to be around for that, but I feel like autonomy is going to be a huge disruptor in the agricultural machinery sector as it comes in.
So do you think that'll have the effect of there's been this constant upward pressure on bigger tractors and more horsepower and more rows and being able to do more with one machine. Do you think that takes that pressure off?
I think
if
so.
If it's autonomous now, because we're not so dependent around the operator, we can kind of optimize around cost and efficiency around the size of the machine without having to worry about the number of machines?
Suppose as an initial step, we replace that 600 horsepower tractor with, say, 1250 horsepower tractors.
Yeah.
But I think it's going to get even smaller than that. I think we're going to have machines that can run between plants and run between rows and perform tasks. And, they may be serviced with additional chemicals, seed, fertilizer, whatever, by drones whenever they call for it to keep going. And we're not limited anymore to how long a human being can work. I mean, this can go 24/7 if need be.
Yeah, we've already started to see some interesting automation designs start to be proposed. We start to see some at trade shows, some early prototypes, going in. I see more of it on the orchard side because that's such a manual, labor-intensive, area of the economy. But it's interesting that might just change the entire landscape of what a tractor looks like in 30 years.
Yeah, and I think 30 years is a good time frame. I mean, we'll certainly start to see some implementation in the next 5 to 10 years, but I think it's going to be, very specific sort of operations in smaller portions of the ag economy. But, if we look down the road 20, 30 years, it's going to be more wholesale. And if we look down the road 50 or 75 years, you can let your imagination go with you.
Yeah.
But we're going to solve problems. Another problem in this country we talk about constantly today is energy generation and distribution. I'm not going to take a conservative point of view or a liberal point of view, but I'm going to take an engineering point of view. And every time we change energy from one form to another, we lose some of it. So our current energy sources, except maybe nuclear, whether it be hydroelectric, tidal, solar, wind, petroleum, coal, they all come ultimately from the sun. And usually there's many, many changes in engine form before they're in a usable fluid. Even a diesel engine today, maybe only 40 or 42% of the energy in the fuel turns into useful work, and the rest goes away as heat. So if energy ultimately comes from the sun, it seems like the solution to this is create the electricity we need directly from the sun. We're not there yet with solar cell efficiency, but we will get there. And so battery storage, we're going to have a zillion electric cars, commercial vehicles, and so on that all have batteries that can be tapped for storage. We may have permanent storage banks located places as battery become better and longer lasting and more power density. And, I see if I look 50 years down the road, I really see most of our electricity coming from solar. And that's not a kick at fossil fuel industry or anything else. It's just, as an engineer looking at the problem, what's the most efficient way to do it? And I don't think it's wind farms. I don't think it's hydroelectric dams. I think it's solar directly.
And if you keep bending the cost curve, and it becomes the cheapest option, that's just what'll get put. New power will be.
Yeah, so the technology has to develop, and then the implementation costs have to drop enough so that it becomes cost effective. But we will reach that point if we continue developing. And when I listen to the news and I hear the differing political viewpoints about this, there's so many days when I wish, why don't you just give this problem to the engineers and let them go solve it instead of arguing about, do this or do that. It just, engineers are the people that are going to solve the problem, so why not empower them to go do it?
I don't disagree with you even a little bit. Well, I think that as we look forward to the future of, what tractors are going to look like, how they're going to be powered, we're always going to need somebody that can validate manufacturers' claims. So I think your guys' job is safe for a while, regardless of what's under the hood, right? I mean, that's a function that's always going to need to be served in the marketplace as an independent laboratory. So I have one closing question, my standard closing question, which is just a bit of fun, but I know you've seen all the different variants of tractors and farm implements, but what's your favorite piece of off-highway equipment? Either something that does something strange or just a cool, gnarly piece of equipment or just something that you've personally been able to operate, what's your favorite piece of off-highway equipment?
Well, I'm going to answer it this way. When I was about 9 years old, I got dumped on my grandpa out by Norman, Oklahoma on a beef cattle farm. And he decided we were going to rebuild his corral. And he had a little David Brown 880 tractor with a front end loader on it. And I had asked him the previous Christmas when he would teach me to drive it. And he said, when you're big enough to push the clutch. So the first thing I did was discover I could now push the clutch. And I could tell he wasn't totally happy about it, but he was a man of his word. And so he would let me, at first with him on the tractor, drive it to the barn and corral that were probably about a quarter mile from the house and back. And by the second or third day, I had convinced him if he would drive the pickup with the tools and I drove the tractor, we wouldn't be running back and forth to the tool shed very much. And so when my parents came back from wherever they'd been, Mexico or something, he arranged a little driving demonstration. And I remember my father standing about a half a foot behind my mother, and I looked over at him as I drove past. My mother had a horrified look on her face. My father was trying really hard to contain a grin. And as soon as I saw that, I knew this was going to be all right.
David Brown 880.
Yeah, and so it was about a 34, 35 horsepower tractor. It was respectable back in those days in the early 70s. I loved those tractors much more than an automobile because they had more levers, they did more things, they were more versatile. It took more skill to operate one, in my view. So my answer to your question is I have loved tractors my entire life, and that's, if I had to pick only one thing to live with the rest of my life that I could play with, it would be a tractor.
I think you're in the right seat then.
Okay.
Thanks, Roger. Very much appreciate your time today, and thank you for showing us around the lab. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much for the opportunity.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to Engineuity. We record and release a new episode every month. Be sure to follow us at Engineuity Podcast on Instagram for updates about future episodes and industry news.